He was the kind of man who could make the world move with a single phone call. Edgar Ferraz, billionaire CEO, respected and feared in the business world. His name adorned magazine covers, his face a symbol of absolute control. But on that Monday morning, his empire trembled. He was found unconscious in his office, face pale, drenched in sweat, eyes blank. Panic spread among employees. Security rushed in. His eldest daughter, Isadora, screamed at paramedics, "Don't mess up. He's the most important man in this country." The private hospital shut its doors. Its owner was on the verge of death. No one knew the cause, but everyone knew it was bad. Initial tests revealed nothing conclusive. No signs of stroke, no heart attack, no organ failure, just a body slowly shutting down. Doctors stared at monitors, puzzled. The family, desperate, demanded answers. Time ticked by, and each theory collapsed. Meanwhile, Edgar remained unconscious, muttering incoherently. Rumors spread. Was it poisoning? An autoimmune disorder? Something psychological? The media speculated, the untouchable magnate has fallen. Is this the end of the Ferraz empire? The Ferraz mansion became a fortress, locked gates, surveillance everywhere. Edgar's wife, elegant and cold, shed quiet tears, her mind more on inheritance than his health. Siblings whispered about wills behind closed doors. The atmosphere was heavy. Something darker loomed, like the illness wasn't just biological but karmic, a punishment for secrets and betrayal. Yet in all this chaos, one figure remained invisible, the maid, the woman who scrubbed the floors of a house now haunted by fear. Edgar wasn't just a businessman, he was an empire. He controlled politicians, rival tycoons, and entire industries. His collapse threatened a global chain reaction. Every second he stayed unconscious, stock prices plummeted, allies panicked, enemies smiled in silence. If Edgar died, the Ferraz name would fall, and hard. But what no one expected was that the solution wouldn't come from the experts. It would come from the shadows. In that cold hospital room, surrounded by high-tech machines, Edgar clung to life. Each monitor beep was a countdown. His family's eyes stayed glued to the screens, missing the anxiety in the corner of the room. She was always there, serving coffee, collecting trays, listening. The maid, the woman everyone called the black cleaning girl. But she saw something the 15 experts missed, and deep inside she knew something didn't add up. The private conference room in the hospital's elite wing was set up in a rush. Red carpets, soundproof windows, and armed security at the door. Inside sat 15 of the most respected doctors in the country. Neurologists, immunologists, infectious disease experts, cardiologists. They all carried world-class resumes, international awards, and one thing in common: ego. A tense silence settled over the room until the hospital director stepped in. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ferraz is dying, and no one knows why. You have full authority. Do whatever it takes." Eyes locked, tense smiles. The battle of egos had begun. Each one wanted to be the savior. None of them wanted to share the spotlight. The theories started pouring out. One thought it was a rare infection. Another insisted it was an undiagnosed neurodegenerative disease. A third was convinced it was an autoimmune breakdown triggered by unknown environmental exposure. The room filled with complex medical jargon, but not a single word brought hope. Giant monitors displayed vitals and test results. One doctor pushed for an experimental nanobot treatment. Another demanded an exclusive, astronomically expensive drug only available overseas. The mood was more of a medical competition than a life-saving mission. No one really listened. They just waited for their turn to speak. Tests began immediately. Hourly blood draws, full-body CT scans, tissue biopsies, experimental medications. Edgar's unconscious body became a high-stakes laboratory. No changes, no improvement. Each doctor justified the failures with sophisticated language, always shifting blame. Meanwhile, the media had caught wind of the expert task force, waiting impatiently for results. Outside, a crowd of cameras and reporters gathered. Inside, reputations hung by a thread. This wasn't just about saving a life. This was about prestige, about being the one name remembered if the billionaire pulled through. Time marched on, mercilessly. With every hour, the tension thickened. Debates turned to arguments. One expert suggested flying Edgar to Switzerland. Another proposed a chemical-induced deep coma to reset the brain. Theories became more desperate. Younger doctors pushed wild ideas. Older ones demanded restraint, but not once did anyone consider an outside opinion. The belief that only they held the answer was rock solid, and in that arrogance they started to miss the most obvious signs, the kind that don't show up on charts or blood panels. In the corner of the staff room, quietly refilling the coffee trays, the maid watched it all. She was invisible, just another piece of furniture to them, but her ears caught every word, every theory, every failed idea. Sometimes she frowned, sometimes she whispered to herself, "That doesn't add up." She had worked for Edgar for years. She knew his habits, his reactions to food, the way his skin smelled when something was wrong, but none of that mattered to the specialists. They had data, degrees, and pride. She had only her eyes, and a heart that refused to let him die without a fight. Hours turned into days, and with each passing day, hope began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. Edgar Ferraz's health was in a free fall, collapsing into a nameless abyss. His once commanding body now looked fragile, entangled in wires, tubes, and machines that barely kept his vitals stable. Nurses avoided eye contact with the family. The doctors, once confident, now hid behind phrases like complications, unexpected response, and systemic instability. Translation? They had no idea what they were dealing with. The Ferraz mansion, though still standing, now felt like a haunted castle, echoing with uncertainty. The family began to crack. Isadora, the eldest daughter, screamed at doctors, demanding solutions that didn't exist. The youngest son, Enzo, disappeared into silence, locking himself in his room with bottles of whiskey and conspiracy theories. Edgar's wife, Lorraine, kept her composure for the cameras, but was already making discreet calls to lawyers and estate managers. Power struggles began to seep through the cracks, but at the center of it all lay Edgar himself, motionless, silent, slipping further away. It was as if everyone was preparing for a farewell no one dared to say out loud. The media, hungry like vultures, circled overhead. Headlines flooded the news. Battle for life. Edgar Ferraz's condition baffles medical experts. Empire on the edge. Ferraz family faces silent war. Paparazzi camped outside the hospital. Neighbors sold private updates through anonymous texts. The entire country watched, some cheering, some jealous, but all waiting for the verdict. The pressure on the doctors became unbearable. One collapsed during a press conference. Another quietly requested leave, citing emotional instability. Edgar's case was no longer medical. It had become a national spectacle. And yet, amid the chaos and attention, a different kind of silence went unnoticed. The maid's pain, hidden behind her uniform, ran deeper than anyone imagined. She didn't just see a billionaire dying. She saw the man who greeted her every morning, who complimented her coffee, who once paid for her son's school without telling a soul. This was personal, and it hurt to see him treated like a failed experiment. Every time she wiped down the edge of his bed, a chill ran down her spine. Even unconscious, Edgar's expression seemed to be crying for help, but no one noticed. Or worse, no one believed that a common woman could see what 15 specialists had missed. On the 10th night, just past midnight, the heart monitor gave off a weaker beep. The medical team rushed in. They stopped what could have been a cardiac arrest, barely in time. But the air was now poisoned with tension, and that was when it happened. One doctor carelessly said the word irreversible in front of the family. Chaos erupted. Crying, phone calls, desperate offers for miracle cures, threats of lawsuits, and there she was, the maid, standing silently with a cloth in her hands and one growing certainty in her blood. They were looking in the wrong direction all along. She had been there since day one, practically a shadow. Dressed in her navy blue uniform, hair tied back in a simple bun, she moved quietly through the hospital halls like someone who didn't want to be seen, and truth be told, no one saw her. No one asked her name. No one looked her in the eye. To the experts, she was just another fixture of the hospital, like a hand sanitizer dispenser or a coat rack. But her eyes saw everything, far more than she let on. And it was there, in the silence between scans and treatments, that she began to notice what no one else did. Something didn't add up with Edgar's symptoms. While the doctors buried themselves in charts and protocols, she watched the details. A slight tremor in one of his fingers that intensified whenever a specific light was turned on. Cold sweat, not during fever spikes, but when certain machines were operating. The way Edgar's mouth twitched when particular sounds played in the room, like he was trying to speak, even while in a coma. Subtle signs, almost invisible to others, but not to her. She'd known Edgar for years. This wasn't a sickness she was seeing. It was a response, a reaction, and more than that, it was pain. Edgar wasn't just ill. He was trying to communicate, but no one was listening. That grey afternoon, while wiping down the table in the diagnostics room, she paused. Her eyes locked on a monitor showing data from the previous night. Numbers, waves, repetitions. She didn't know medical language, but she understood patterns. And on that screen, there was something strange. Peaks and drops, always at the same time. 2:17 a.m. Every night, a spike, a collapse, then stabilization. It was a cycle, a pattern, a reaction. And then it hit her. Every night, exactly at that time, the cleaning team changed out the industrial disinfectant. A new imported product with a sharp, unfamiliar smell. Her instincts screamed. Something was wrong. In the hallway, delivering coffee to the lead doctor, she overheard two residents whispering, "Maybe it's neurodegenerative, but it's not behaving like it should." She wanted to say something, wanted to tell them about Edgar's severe allergies, that years ago he'd fallen seriously ill after a skin treatment that used similar chemicals, but she froze. It wasn't the first time. She'd tried before, gently, quietly, to mention things to nurses. They always brushed her off, sometimes with polite smiles, other times sharp dismissals. "That's not your place." Still, she knew she was seeing something no one else could. Alone, at the end of her shift, she entered Edgar's room. She walked up to the bed slowly, gently touched his hand, as if asking for permission. Her eyes filled with tears, and in a soft whisper she said, "I know what they don't." In that moment, Edgar's fingers moved, barely, just a flicker, but enough to send chills down her spine. She stepped back, stunned. Was it real? She didn't know, but something inside her knew, without a doubt, she was right. For the first time, it wasn't just intuition, it was certainty. And that certainty would soon be tested, because soon she would have to speak up, loudly, even if no one wanted to hear her. She tried with all the calm she had left, with the humility she had learned to carry throughout life. It started subtly. During a shift change, she quietly said to a nurse, "That new disinfectant, it's got a very strong smell, doesn't it? Mr. Edgar always hated products like that." The nurse smiled dismissively, not even pausing her charting. "Sweetie, the doctors know what they're doing." Days later, the maid tried speaking to one of the younger residents, someone who seemed more open. He listened, raised an eyebrow, then ended with a joke. "If that's true, you deserve a medical degree." Laughter, dismissal, disappearance. Her attempts grew more desperate. She knew she didn't have a degree. She didn't speak in medical terms. Her words meant less than a printed monitor reading. But she knew Edgar. She knew his body, his routines, his reactions. And more than that, she saw. She saw what no one else did. His body's behavior, the changes in his vitals, the exact moments he worsened, all of it tied to environmental triggers, not medical ones. It was a silent poisoning, a constant, invisible assault. And still, she couldn't break through. It was like screaming from inside a glass box, where no one outside could hear. One morning she gathered her courage and tried again. She approached Edgar's wife, Lorraine, her eyes watery, voice trembling with hope. "Mrs. Lorraine, please, I know it sounds strange, but I'm certain he's reacting to the smell of that new chemical." Lorraine looked at her like she was an insect. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, sighed, and said, "If I want medical advice, I'll call Harvard." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the maid with her heart crushed. That wasn't just rejection, it was punishment, for daring to cross the invisible line between those who give orders and those who obey them. As the days passed, the atmosphere shifted. She wasn't just ignored anymore, she was seen as a problem, a nuisance, an interruption. Someone whispered, "She's getting too bold." Another muttered, "Next thing you know, she'll be writing prescriptions. Better keep that kind in their place." The worst came when some nurses began to sabotage her, knocking over trays, blaming her for mistakes she didn't make. The pressure became psychological, quiet, vicious, but she didn't give up. Because this wasn't just for Edgar anymore, it was for her. For every time her voice had been silenced, for every moment when knowing wasn't enough, when you had to be heard. That night, before going home, she stood at the door of Edgar's room. She looked at his fragile body and whispered, "They don't want to hear me, but I'll speak, even if it's the last thing I do." Then, As a silent act of defiance, she took out an old notebook and began writing. Everything she had observed, in her firm, clear handwriting. It was her private dossier, her proof, her weapon, because she knew the time was coming when she'd have to face them all, and she would not bow her head. It was past midnight when everything changed. The hospital was wrapped in heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the soft steps of the overnight staff. The maid had stayed late again, claiming she had extra work, but the truth was, she just couldn't leave. Something kept pulling her back to Edgar's room. She had written down everything over the last few days, the times, the symptoms, the strange behaviors, but that night, she needed to see it with her own eyes, without interference. And sure enough, at exactly 2:17 a.m. it happened again. The monitor's beeps sped up. Edgar began to sweat. His body tensed slightly, as if recoiling from something invisible. She held her breath. It was the same pattern, but something felt different that night. The air was stronger, more acidic. The smell of that new industrial cleaner, the one the janitors praised as extra effective, was sharper, more concentrated. And then, as if fate itself wanted to speak to her, a nearby window cracked open, letting the draft blow the scent directly toward Edgar. That's when he coughed. A dry, weak cough, but real. The first physical response in days. No doctors were present. The night staff had grown complacent. But she was there. She saw it. And she felt it in her gut. That product wasn't just irritating him. It was triggering something, a toxin. And somehow, it was building up in his body, unnoticed. Her heart pounded. She ran to the supply room and grabbed a bottle of the old hospital detergent, the one they used before switching to the new chemical. Quietly, carefully, she cleaned a small patch of floor near Edgar's bed, using the older solution. Then she waited, watched, and for the first time in days, the monitor stabilized. His reactions stopped. The sweating slowed. Edgar's chest rose and fell more naturally. It was as if, finally, he could breathe without pain. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. This was real, a tangible clue, a clear cause. In that moment, there was no more doubt. The cleaner was the problem. But how could she prove it? How could she convince 15 arrogant specialists that the answer had been hiding in a cleaning product all along? She knew speaking up wouldn't be enough. She had to show them. She had to spark a reaction that no one could deny. So she stayed up the rest of the night, scrubbing Edgar's room with the old detergent section by section. If he improved by morning, she'd have her proof. As she worked, tears slipped down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from rage, from relief, from everything all at once. For the first time, it wasn't just a feeling, it was fact, and she was ready to put it in front of the world, with courage. When morning came, something remarkable happened. Edgar improved, just slightly, barely enough to notice from the outside. But the machines told the truth. His heart rate leveled, his breathing became less strained. Nurses chalked it up to chance. The doctors were still asleep, but she knew it wasn't chance, it was action, cause and effect. The truth was beginning to surface, not through lab tests or diagnostics, but through the hands of a woman the world chose not to see. And this was only the beginning, the first crack in the wall of arrogance, and she was about to bring the whole thing down. The sun hadn't even fully risen when she made her decision. That morning wouldn't be like the others. She wasn't going to just clean. She wasn't going to just watch. She was going to speak. She arrived early, uniform crisp, notebook in hand, heart pounding. She knew there would be no room for hesitation. During the doctor's morning briefing, she walked into the conference room uninvited. The 15 experts were there, surrounded by screens, charts, and yet another set of inconclusive diagnostics. She cleared her throat gently and began, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe I've found something important about Mr. Edgar's condition." Silence fell, not the kind that listens, but the kind that mocks. The first to react was the lead doctor. "You're with housekeeping, correct?" She nodded calmly. "Yes, but..." He cut her off. "Then please let the professionals do their job. We have enough complications as it is." A few chuckled, others looked away, uncomfortable, but she didn't back down. She opened her notebook and laid out her notes. Times, reactions, printed monitor readouts. All of his worst episodes happen at the same time every night. They align with the use of a new industrial cleaner. "I ran a test last night, reverted the cleaning, and Mr. Edgar started to improve." Another doctor interrupted, smirking. "So now we've got ourselves a detective?" The room became a courtroom of condescension. The pressure intensified, but she stood her ground. She explained every detail with clarity: the coughing, the physical reactions, the improvement after switching back to the old cleaning product. It was obvious she knew what she was talking about, even without the medical terms. One young resident tried to listen, but a senior physician dismissed him sharply. "You're really wasting time on this art theory." Then came the harshest blow from a renowned female doctor, cold and composed. "These kinds of suggestions are dangerous. Frankly, they're irresponsible. You could be fired for creating this kind of panic." She swallowed hard, not out of fear, but from the cruel realization that truth doesn't matter when it comes from the wrong mouth. But that day, something had shifted. The family was arriving, and news of Edgar's slight improvement had started to spread through the corridors. His daughter, Isadora, stormed into the room mid-argument, demanding an update. The maid took a deep breath, and with the courage of someone who had nothing left to lose, said firmly, "It was only after I stopped using the new cleaner in his room that he started reacting. The monitor logs are there. I'm just asking you to check." Isadora, confused and irritated, turned to the doctors. "Is this true, what she's saying?" The experts hesitated. The arrogance began to crack. Something had clearly changed, and none of their theories could explain it. Even under attack, she remained standing. Her hands trembled as she held her notebook, but her eyes did not. Then quietly, a young lab technician who had been listening stepped forward. "I can run a chemical analysis on the new cleaner. If she's right, the toxicity will show up." A heavy silence fell over the room. It wasn't just her anymore. Someone with a badge and a lab coat was taking her seriously. And that changed everything. The confrontation, once one-sided, had turned into a real battle. Truth was starting to seep through the cracks in their pride. And at that moment, though still doubted and disrespected, she was beginning to win. As whispers of a possible mistake by the medical team began spreading through the hospital's back halls, the atmosphere shifted. Not abruptly, but like a fog seeping through invisible cracks. What was once certainty and control became tension and doubt. The Faraz family, so used to bending the world with money and influence, began to taste the bitter edge of helplessness. Edgar, the pillar, the center, remained unconscious. But something had changed. He was no longer getting worse. More importantly, his vitals were showing subtle signs of improvement. Improvements that began right when the maid changed the cleaning routine. Lorraine, his wife, cold and composed until now, locked herself in the private suite's bathroom for nearly 2 hours. When she emerged, her eyes were red. She wasn't just crying from fear of losing her husband. She was mourning the possibility that she had been wrong, that she had dismissed the only person who might have been right all along. Isadora, the daughter, grew restless. For the first time, she didn't bark orders, didn't demand updates. She simply watched the maid with a conflicted look, part suspicion, part respect. The youngest son, Enzo, left his isolation. He sat at his father's bedside and held his hand. For the first time since the ordeal began, silent panic crept in. What if it was true? What if all the doctors with their prestigious degrees and polished confidence were wrong? And what if the only person who truly knew Edgar, not as a patient, but as a man, was the woman they'd all chosen to ignore? The thought was unbearable for many, but it was inescapable. Doubt seeped into the family's minds like poison into clean water. Even the executives from Faraz Corporation, who frequently visited the hospital to discuss succession plans, started asking quietly, "What if she's right? Are we really going to let him die because of pride?" Even the energy within the hospital began to shift. Nurses who had once ignored her began nodding silently in greeting. One resident offered her a cup of coffee. The hospital's director, who had never once acknowledged her existence, asked to speak with her in private. He wanted to hear her observations calmly. It was as if the entire system, under the weight of potential tragedy and growing guilt, was starting to bend, not out of kindness, but out of fear. Fear of being remembered as the ones who let a man die because they dismissed the only voice speaking the truth. Deep down, everyone knew if Edgar died, the scandal would be inevitable, and if he lived because of her, the public disgrace would be even greater. That fear, more than anything else, was what now drove the people who had once looked past her. There was no more room for arrogance. The survival of the Faraz name and the reputations of everyone around it now rested in the hands of the woman they refused to hear, and she knew it. For the first time, she didn't walk with her shoulders hunched. She stood tall, focused, and ready for what came next. It was 3:47 p.m. when the alarms in Edgar's room started screaming. The heart monitor spiked. Blood pressure plummeted. Oxygen levels dropped to a dangerous low. It was another crisis, worse than all the ones before. Nurses rushed in. Doctors were called in a panic. Chaos returned with full force. Eyes locked onto the monitors, but no one reacted fast enough. One thing was clear. Edgar was seconds away from crossing the point of no return. Time was no longer a tool. It had become the enemy. The maid, just meters away, ran to the door and screamed, not just for the doctors, but for the lab tech who had promised to test the cleaner. He appeared seconds later, breathless, clutching an envelope. "I finished the tests," he shouted. "That product is toxic, highly reactive to allergy-prone compounds." Shock hit the room like a slap. One doctor tried to dismiss the findings, another questioned the accuracy. But there was no time for debate. Edgar was crashing, and the maid knew. Either she acted now or he was going to die. She burst into the room without permission. She grabbed a cleaning bucket and shouted, "Bring the old detergent, now! Replace everything. Towels, sheets, the air." Staff hesitated, frozen by protocol. But then Isadora screamed, "Do what she says, now!" That broke the wall. Orders from above shattered the fear. Within minutes, the room was cleared. All surfaces scrubbed with the old product. The air system shut off. The tension was suffocating. Outside the door, the maid and the lab tech watched the monitors like a countdown. Every second felt like eternity, waiting for either the final crash or a miracle. 10 minutes later, the unthinkable happened. The heart rate leveled. Breathing returned to normal. Edgar's eyes moved beneath his eyelids. A doctor covered her mouth in disbelief. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was stunned. The machines were showing what no drug ever managed. A simple change, proposed by someone no one had listened to, was reversing the condition. And then, as if summoned by her faith, Edgar opened his eyes. Slowly, weakly, but alive, awake, back. The room exploded into emotion. Lorraine collapsed to her knees. Isadora wept openly. Enzo wrapped his arms around his father, as if to shield him from everything. But at the center of it all, at the heart of the miracle, stood her, the invisible woman, the ignored maid, the one they laughed at, now the one who brought him back. The critical moment had passed, and with it the mask of arrogance shattered. All that remained was the truth, and the crushing weight of having ignored it for far too long. In the days following Edgar Ferraz's miraculous recovery, the hospital became a minefield of awkward silences and lowered eyes. Doctors who once carried themselves like gods now avoided eye contact. Nurses whispered behind closed doors. The maid, whose name had never even appeared on official records, was now spoken of with care and respect. Mrs. Alzira. Yes, now she had a name, a story, a presence, and more than anything, she had earned respect. The lab team confirmed it. The new industrial cleaner reacted with known allergens already listed in Edgar's medical file, something anyone could have seen if they had bothered to look. The negligence was undeniable and unforgivable. The family, overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude, tried to make it right, with money, with a public apology, with interview offers. But Alzira declined it all, with a soft smile, with a calm that made them squirm even more than her truth. She didn't want fame. She didn't want the spotlight. What she wanted, she already had. Every lowered gaze, every awkward apology, every moment of stunned silence, that was her revenge. A revenge that didn't scream, that didn't humiliate, but one that toppled giants using nothing more than observation, persistence, and truth. On the day Edgar was discharged, the hospital arranged a quiet farewell, but Edgar changed the plan. He insisted Alzira walk him out. In a wheelchair, holding her hand, he turned to the cameras and said clearly, "This woman saved my life, not with scalpels, with sensitivity, with courage, with truth." Cameras flashed. The entire country watched. Social media exploded. And for the first time, the narrative didn't belong to the powerful, but to someone the world had chosen not to see. Weeks later, Edgar held a press conference. There, he announced the creation of a new foundation focused on listening to invisible workers, from janitors to drivers, cooks to doormen. He called it the Alzira Institute, his way of turning guilt into legacy, and she, with the same quiet strength she once used to mop the floors of arrogance, began taking stages, giving talks, teaching the kind of wisdom no degree provides: empathy, listening, and respect. Her revenge didn't destroy, it rebuilt, because real justice isn't loud, it's felt and remembered. And so, the woman no one saw, but who saw everything, became a symbol of resilience, truth, and dignity. Edgar lived, the system shook, and Alzira, she was invisible no more. Moral of the story: true wisdom doesn't always wear a white coat. Arrogance blinds, but humility sees clearly. And when truth is ignored out of pride, justice will always find its voice, even if it speaks through a mop. If this story moved you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been ignored, even when you were right? Have you witnessed someone judged by their job or appearance? We want to hear your story, because every voice deserves to be heard.